Alright, welcome back to Questing Beast. I'm Ben, and today we are looking at Zweihander, which is a Kickstarter game that I was sent a review copy of to take a look at. Now, Zweihander is a kind of a retro clone based off of the Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay game, especially the first and second edition. So rather than mirroring a lot of D&D's tropes, it mirrors that. Now, of course, this isn't actually put out by Games Workshop, and so it's a bit off-brand. Things have been renamed a little bit, though it's very clearly intended for the old world, or really for any role-playing game set in a rather grimdark, low fantasy universe. First thing to point out is that this book is huge. It is 650 pages or so, but a lot of that is because it is a complete role-playing game. It includes everything that would be in a game master's book, like in D&D, and in a monster manual, as well as a player's handbook. It contains a huge amount of information, so I'm going to try and go through and hit the main points so you can see what you would get if you bought this book and what its main advantages and disadvantages are, in my opinion. All right, so let's look at the spine. And that's what our back looks like. So this is the Kickstarter edition, as you can see here. It is a beautifully printed, professionally printed with offset printing. This isn't a print-on-demand deal that was delivered to the Kickstarter backers. I believe that it is going to be available to other people, possibly in a print-on-demand format at some point in the future, although the PDF is also available right now. So let's crack it open and look inside. It comes with an awesome red ribbon, which I actually used. I kept reading the book and having to save my place here and there, and then realizing, hey, I have a giant ribbon. So that's awesome. I love books that do that. Zweihander. Of course, a Zweihander, if you're not aware, just means a two-hander. Basically, in German, it refers to a giant two-handed sword. So that kind of conveys the tone that this book is going for. Writing and design by Daniel Fox, with a number of other contributors. And virtually all of the art is done by one artist, Dejan Mandek. Hopefully I'm pronouncing his name correctly. Here we have our table of contents. And all of the art is done in a black and white style that looks a lot like it's done with pencils and charcoal, and really conveys a dark or grim-dark universe very effectively, I believe. So let's look at its basic rules for how to play. And the basic core of the system is a percentile system, meaning that your skill is going to be measured from 1 to 100. Then you'll roll percentile dice, and if you roll your skill or less, you succeed. And if you roll above, you fail. I love that system. It's very old school. It keeps with the old school Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay game system, and it's very intuitive because you know instantly your percentile chance to succeed. And of course, the game master can alter those odds if they find it appropriate. However, one thing I noticed while looking at these basic rules is that there is a lot of other subsystems that are tacked onto this in order to account for different situations. And my impression is that there's too many of them and they're too different from each other. So, for example, let's see here. If you're giving an assisted test, so if you're helping someone else, someone else's character complete a task, what you can do is you can hand them another D10, and they roll that D10 with their percentiles, and they can use the D10 that you gave them in place of one of theirs if it would help them succeed. So it's a lot like advantage in D&D. But then you have other situations later on, let's see, flipping the results to succeed, where it says, under some circumstances, an ability may allow you to flip the results to succeed at a skill test and take the better result. So when this happens, so when you fail a test, basically you can swap the units and the tens dice with each other to determine if you're successful, and you can keep the better result. So it's like another advantage system, but it is distinct from the advantage system used when you're assisting someone, which seems a little strange to me. It seems like you should just have one advantage system. Similarly, when we have opposed tests, we run into a little bit of a problem. Since you're just rolling under, it can be a little bit difficult to figure out what player wins when you have, for example, a strength versus strength contest going on. And the system presented here is much too complicated for my taste, unnecessarily so, I feel. I believe it says you roll your percentile dice, and then you look at the tens die, and then you add that to the attribute bonus generated from your main attribute, and that is your margin of success. And then your opponent does the same thing, and you compare margins of success, which seems unnecessary to me. In other roll under systems, there's a much simpler way of doing this, which is you both trying to roll underneath your skills, your percentile skill, just as usual. And if one person succeeds, then you win. But if both succeed or both fail, then whoever rolled higher is the winner. It's very simple. The odds work out perfectly, and you don't have to introduce a separate system in order to do it. So I wish that there was more consistency with the subsystems used with a D100 system. However, this system is very modular, and I feel like it could be modified pretty easily by a competent game master. There is a fortune pool, which means that there is meta currency that exists in the game that you can spend in order to get your character out of scrapes, but then that meta currency goes over to the DM and they can spend that to get you back into problems again. I'm not really a big fan of meta currency since I believe it really takes you out of the game. You start analyzing the game from a higher level rather than being immersed in it. However, it's not as bad as some systems, given that there's always a set amount of fortune in every session, and it isn't generated from tasks. So I think it's okay, but I may or may not use it if I was to run this myself. So we're going to start looking at character creation here. Character creation, you can go into a lot of detail with it, and very much in keeping with old school stuff, you can fully randomize your entire character from top to bottom. That's an absolute possibility, which could be a lot of fun, and I may actually try that at some point and make a video of it. We'll see how it goes. So first steps are generate your main attributes, which are, read them off here. You have your combat, brawn, agility, perception, intelligence, willpower, and fellowship. You choose your sex and your race. Next, what you're going to want to do is to determine your archetype. And there's a couple archetypes here: academic, commoner, knave, ranger, and there's a few more. Each one has a number of professions within it. And the professions are really the core of this system. They could really be considered your class. And unlike a lot of games, this has a ridiculous number of these professions, providing you with a huge variety of types of characters to play, which I think is really fantastic. Now, after you've chosen your main archetype, but before you've actually gone to your professions, you need to start creating some of your secondary attributes. And that's things like Peril Threshold and Damage Threshold. Peril is basically like your stress level, and it's more like what hit points are in D&D. And then you have your Damage Threshold, which measures your actual level of injury. And I think it's a good idea that there's two tracks for this, although there are a lot of secondary mechanics and secondary trackers within your character sheet that adds a level of complexity. There's also an encumbrance limit. And one great thing is that encumbrance is very simplified in this game. You're not tracking everything pound by pound. Objects have just an encumbrance rating, like 1, 2, or 3, and you just add those up. And you're trying to keep it within a fairly limited number. That makes it tracking that pretty easy. You have initiative like in most games. And you start generating your background here. Season of birth, your dooming, your age group, your distinguishing marks, and so on. Now, by the time we get into upbringing, we start running into a issue that I have with Zweihander as a whole, and this runs across the whole book. It isn't a mechanical issue so much as the way the book is written, and generally the book is very overwritten. A lot of the text in the book could be cut by at least half without really reducing the useful information that a game master would need. For example, here you can roll your upbringing, and which gives you a favored primary attribute. You can be cultured, forgotten, industrious, opportunistic, and so on. And each of these is fairly intuitive. They make sense. But after each one, you get an entire paragraph describing basically what that word means. And that's a pattern that you see across this whole book. There's a point later on where it's talking about light sources, and it's talking about bonfires and campfires and lanterns and candles. And instead of simply telling you that here's a bunch of different light sources, after each of them, it gives you an entire paragraph describing what a bonfire is, or what a campfire is, or what a candle is, and how they work. It's way more information than anyone would need. And if you understand English and you have the basic common experiences that most people have, you just don't need that information. You're going to skim right through it. And this pattern of really padding out the information and adding way more than is necessary can cause problems, because a lot of useful information starts getting buried. It extends the length of the book to the point where it's hard to find stuff that you actually need, and it becomes hard to sift out what in here do I actually need to read and what is just fluff. It's all sort of melded together, and that is a problem for me. So next up we come to alignment. And alignment is always between order and chaos in this book, and it's always between two different personality types. For example, enlightenment versus detachment, or ferocity versus hatred, and so on. And the book really mechanizes these alignments in a way that D&D doesn't. You are mechanically rewarded in the form of reward points, which are like XP, for following these things, or acting against them under the right circumstances. And that is a level of enforcement of role-playing that I am not completely comfortable with. It doesn't speak of trusting your players to play the way that they want, and instead sort of shoehorning them into a particular path. I'm not crazy about that because I tend to like my players to just do what they feel is natural. But this book does put a lot of emphasis on role-playing as the way that you get experience points. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later once we come to it. But as we can see, as we go on, we see some of the patterns that I talked about before emerge, where with each of these dichotomies between, for example, romanticism and lechery, or pride and arrogance, it's very clear what those mean. Everyone knows what those words mean. But instead, we have several pages basically describing what those words mean. It's something that you could basically look up in a dictionary if you wanted to. It's just way more information than is really necessary in order to run the game. So next we get some information on how alignment actually influences your character. And it influences primarily through affecting your corruption. So corruption is another track that you have to keep track of. When characters act in a way that the Game Master feels is influenced by chaos, he has to award them corruption points. Now you would think that this would simply corrupt the character, but it doesn't really work that way. Instead, over the course of the session, they may slowly gain more and more corruption points. And then at the end of the session, you look at those corruption points and you roll a die, and if it's under the number of corruption points that you have, you gain a point on a tracker that tracks where you are between order and chaos. So that's sort of like a secondary level above corruption points that gets influenced. But that in itself doesn't do anything either, because you have to wait until that tracker gets all the way to order or all the way to chaos, and then another effect kicks in. So you have like 3 levels of mechanics all affecting one another just to get across how corruption and order and chaos work. For me, it is way too much information and way too much to track. As a GM, I would not be really interested in making judgment calls about my players' actions all the time and giving them different amounts of corruption based on what they do. I would be very tempted to just remove that entire system from the game. Although that may be difficult to do due to the fact that many of the spells and other mechanics do rely on the level of order or chaos or corruption points or fate points that you get from using this system. Now, Chapter 4 gets into one of my favorite parts of this book, which is all of the professions, and they are amazing. There are a ton of them. They are all fully illustrated, they are flavorful, and they make you want to play that type of character. So let's take a look at them. First off, it talks a little bit about buying character advances, because over the course of your career, you're really going to get 3 professions, one at each of the 3 tiers that your character goes through. And your combination of those 3 professions really fleshes out who your character is. But in order to advance, you have to get reward points. You start out with 1,000 of these that you can spend on advancements. And then over the course of each session, you gain more reward points. Now, these reward points mostly come from role-playing and from showing up to the game and following the story. Now, the problem here is that the reward points aren't given out for anything proactive the player does, besides role-playing. And even the role-playing reward is subjective. It's basically if the Game Master liked your role-playing or not. This can be a problem because it doesn't really lead to very proactive parties. In a lot of other games, XP is placed wherever you want the players to go or what you want them to do. So in old school games, XP is mostly rewarded for gold, at least in D&D. And that's because it's incentivizing players to go out there, take their own initiative, find gold, find ways to get it, and plot and plan in order to get rich and therefore level up. In this game, if you sat around in a tavern and just did a lot of good role-playing, you would slowly level up to an amazing character. It's that and following the story, which is by and large presumed to be a pre-written plot by the Game Master. Since I'm not very interested in writing out pre-written plots, and I would want to run this in a more free-form sandbox sort of way, where the players are really in charge of their own actions and choosing what to do next, I would really be tempted to tear out this whole rewards point system and put those reward points on other things. For example, getting gold, or even converting characters to their side, or exploring new places, similar to the XP system that was put out in Unearthed Arcana recently by D&D. I think putting reward points on those things would be a better incentive for the players to take charge. In any case, let's look at some of the professions. I can't go through all of them because there are a ton of them, but here's a list of your basic professions, right? Each of these is essentially its own character class. For example, we have an anarchist, has a brief description of them. It gives them a special ability, and then it has a number of advances. So these are the different skills that you gain. And each skill rank, each skill has up to 3 ranks. And each time you choose it, its rank goes up by 1. And that adds a 10% bonus to the attribute that it's related to. So if your main attribute is 35%, and you have 1 rank in eavesdrop, then you would have a 45% chance of rolling eavesdrop, right? So we have animal tamers, antiquarians, apothecaries, artisans, astrologers, barber surgeons, and so on. This list is so fantastic that I would be very tempted to use it in all sorts of other games. It's a great NPC list, if nothing else. This goes on for how many pages? A lot. There's even advanced professions. So we go through all of these pages, profession after profession after profession. Again, all fully illustrated, all with their own mechanics. It's a huge temptation for players. As they just flip through this, they're going to get amazing ideas of what they want their character to be. Chapter 5 is all about skills. We have a list of all the skills, what their primary attribute is, whether they're special or whether they're common, and focuses that you can get. Focuses just take one particular aspect of those skills and make you even more specialized in it. We have a description of each skill, and with each skill comes a table telling how you might adjust the difficulty under different circumstances. Chapter 6 is all about talents that you can get, which are a little bit like feats in other games. And Chapter 7 is all about trappings, which is essentially the equipment chapter. So this includes everything you might need and more. One thing is that the money system is based on the old-fashioned British system, so pennies, shillings, and pounds essentially, where you have 1-12 and 1-20 ratios, which is very thematic for if you're playing in England in the medieval era, for example. But it could be a little confusing for others because you have to do a lot of conversions in your head that are not base 10. Chapter 8 is all about combat, and combat is based on a action point system. Essentially, you get 3 action points, and then on your turn, you spend these your action points on a number of different actions and in different combinations, although you can only attack once per turn. This can include saving your action points in order to do parries on your opponent's turns. There's also a lot of perilous stunts that you can do to really mix up combat and make things more interesting than simply I attack, you attack. Chapter 9 is all about hazards and healing. And this starts out with some really fantastic stuff on diseases and sicknesses and disorders, mental disorders you might have. And this is a sort of thing that is not really fleshed out in most role-playing games. But due to the grimdark nature of this type of game, it's great that all this stuff is included. I like having lots of different plagues that I can inflict on people. That's really cool. We have your basic rules for extreme weather, falling, lots of different types of toxins, which is really great because a lot of books have poisons, but they don't describe the poisons. Here we actually have stuff like that. And rules for peril and damage. So peril is like your stress level, and the more peril that you are in, the less effect your skills have. So basically it removes your skill levels from helping your rolls out. You also have damage tracks, which go from unharmed to lightly wounded, moderately wounded, seriously, grievously, and slain. What happens is that when you take damage, you figure out if that the damage roll from a weapon, say, is above your damage threshold. You have a damage threshold that is derived from your character's brawn plus stuff that they get from their armor. And if it's above that threshold, then they move down this damage track. They can move down more than one if they take a lot of damage at once. And when they take one of these, there's a risk that they may actually take a serious injury that can be more permanent. And that's very much in keeping with old school Warhammer Fantasy Roleplaying games, because there's a great death and dismemberment table at the end of this book that I'll show you. You also get injuries, and we have recuperation time, which can take a long time. It takes a very brutal, very realistic look at combat. So if you're into that sort of thing, this could be some really great rules for you to use. Chapter 10 is all about magic, and I love this chapter because it really brings to mind my memories as a kid of looking through the Warhammer Fantasy battle game, the actual tabletop game, and looking at all the spells and the magic system and really feeling immersed in this weird fantasy world. And all of that is brought back here, although of course not in an explicitly Warhammer fashion. It's definitely derived from it. It has the winds of magic very similar to that universe. We have the winds of animism, astromancy, elementalism, luminescence, morticism, necromancy, pyromancy, shadowmancy, sorcery, transmutation, the winds intertwined, which include the void and the silver winds. And then we start getting into the different gods, because you have arcane magic, which has all of these different winds, and then you have divine magic, which uses these different deities. Each of the deities is fleshed out with their own unique symbols, commandments, what their priesthood looks like. I think the flavor here is actually really great. Your rules for finding and recording magic, which are quite brutal, and it's very difficult to cast spells. You actually have to research stuff. You have to find a way to write it down. You have to test to see if you are smart enough to know it. And then you can try and channel magic, channel the winds of magic into your spell, though there is always a heavy risk involved when you try and do this. Magic is dangerous, and it's kind of stupid to use it. So we start off with some generalist petty magic, and then we have a nice fat spell list covering a wide variety of very interesting spells, and not all of them are damage spells, which I really appreciate. There's some interesting creative use spells in here as well, which is fantastic. Chapter 11 is the Game Mastery chapter, which is fairly straightforward. It's the typical game mastery advice that you would usually expect, although tailored for this game of brutal daring do, where the focus is not so much on saving the world, but on the world changing your character. Here we have some additional rules for combat. Now, one pet peeve of mine is that this was not put into the actual combat chapter. It's a little strange that it was put here, because it means that when you are running through combat, you're going to have to flip to two different places in some cases during the game. But this is basically the death and dismemberment table of what happens when you take a moderate injury, a serious injury, or a grievous injury. So things like a maimed foot, mutilated hand, punctured lung, severed artery. So you have these very flavorful, permanent inflictions upon your character that's going to change them over the long term. We have descriptions of what happens when you slay someone using bladed, crushing, gunpowder, or missile weapons, if you need more descriptions to add. This reminds me a lot of the stuff that we see in Dungeon Crawl Classics, which is really cool. And similar to Dungeon Crawl Classics, we have chaos manifestations. So we have what happens when the spells go wrong. Your wizard can have all sorts of horrible mutations happen to them that twist them beyond recognition in some cases. We also have malignancy and divine punishments that may be inflicted upon you by the different deities and atonements that you may have to go through. So it's great to see other old school games informing this one, because I think that there is a relationship there. We have a quick section on non-player characters, and including this very nice table, actually, of motivations that you can roll on to give the NPCs a drive of their own and goals to pursue. However, like a lot of the book, each of these very sensible, easy to understand words includes an entire paragraph describing what that word means, which is unnecessary and just simply takes up several pages for no good reason, really. You could use this space to include several other tables, which is what I would have preferred, that would allow you to quickly flesh out NPCs in other ways. This section on corruption goes more into detail about when you should give your players corruption points if you're using that system. And the number of things that you would have to give them corruption points for would mean that I would have to stay on top of my players constantly and be handing out points to them for the things that they did. Like I said before, that is just too much bookkeeping for me. Though if you really want to get into that aspect of the role playing, it is here for you. The more evil things that you do, the more corruption you get, and the faster you will move towards chaos. You can also get fate points by moving far enough up on the order track. Fate points can save your life by preventing you from being instantly killed if you get a bad roll during combat. a number of addictions you can get, and insanities and mutations due to moving too close to the chaos end of the spectrum. And finally, we have some possible house rules that you could use for how to run characters. For example, creating a stable of characters that you pick from every time that you play. We also have some information on playing Aztlan and Grendels and Orcs and Skrizaks. These are basically the demi-human classes like the Skaven and the Orcs and the reptilian humanoids in the Warhammer universe. After a short section on world building, we have the next big section of the book, which is the Bestiary, which is a giant fat section of the book. In fact, it includes most of the rest of the book, going through a wide variety of monsters. And similar to the professions, all of these are fleshed out, all of these are illustrated, and they are just really wonderful. They really bring about the flavor and the terror that's supposed to be invoked when you're playing this sort of game. So, for example, you have organized, the creatures are organized by the type of creature. So we have abyssals, which all have great illustrations. Higher demons, hell beasts, and so on and so forth. Animals are thankfully grouped into these categories, so they don't have to have one whole listing for each animal. Large insects, smaller animals, and so on. That's a smart way to do it. And this list of monsters goes on and on and on and on and on. It's great. It's a full-sized monster manual tacked onto the end of this. It's not selling it as a separate book. It's all right here. After the monsters, we have some loot and lucre, which gives you a nice gigantic random table for different types of treasure that you can dig up. Gemstones, commodities if you want to get into trade, and so on. Chapter 13 is the final chapter of the book, and it is a pre-written adventure. And it was a little disappointing for me because it is very explicitly a linear adventure. You are expected to go through each of the steps in order and follow the clues in order to get to the end. It really enforces in my mind that the intent of this book is not so much player-driven adventures, but scripted adventures that are followed through. Now, that's not to say you couldn't run this in a more open style, and that's definitely what I would do if I was running it. But I would have liked to see much more support for that, given that a lot of old school players really prefer that method. At the end of the adventure, we have reward points that are given out for if the players completed each step in order of the 10 parts of this adventure. And then finally, we have an appendix at the end, which has some useful tools, damage condition trackers for NPCs, and some great chasing complications. These random tables are fantastic. I wish more books had them. This is quality content that is actually useful while you are playing the game. I wish a lot more of the book was like this, actually. So different types of wilderness encounters. This is excellent. This does a lot of your work for you. Traveling around in haunted woods or moors or old roads or rivers, and they have a separate table of different things that you can run into. Excellent. That is what I'm talking about in terms of support for more open style roaming adventures where the players are leading. We have Taints of Chaos. This book would sync up really well with the Metamorphica, which includes a lot of these types of mutations and chaos effects. I've reviewed the Metamorphica previously, so I think that would work really well with this. And a nice summary of actions in combat before we get to our character sheet, which is very functional, but not very illustrated. I would have expected it to be a little bit more grim and more illustrative, but it's very functional. And there we have it, with all the Kickstarter backers in the back. All right, so Zweihander. In summary, this book leaves me with a lot of mixed feelings. I love the ambition of it. I love the size of this thing. I love the feeling that there is an entire world packed into here. I love how fleshed out it is. It is, however, my biggest complaint is that it is quite overwritten. This book could have a lot cut out of it without losing any important information, and it would make the book much easier to read and easier to digest. I'm also not crazy about the fact that it is definitely geared towards role-playing. That's what it rewards, which rewards basically players who are good at acting rather than players who are clever and self-motivated, which is what I prefer. However, in my final analysis, would I play this game? Absolutely. If there was a game master who was running a Zweihander game, I would be extremely intrigued and I would want to get in on it. I think the idea of using these professions to build a complex character is great. I love the lethality of the game because I think that element of it really does make the player stop and think before they get into combat. The brutality of magic and so on also adds a level of risk to the game that I think is really wonderful. And again, slows the game down and stops the players from thinking that they are superheroes and puts them more in the mindset of normal people. And that adds to immersion, which I really appreciate. Now, would I actually run this game? Hard to say. I probably would if I was able to take out some of the subsystems or the meta systems, I suppose you could call them, that are added on to the core that I'm not really a big fan of. I think the core, which is a percentile system, is slick and intuitive and easy to use, but a lot of the extra stuff on top of it would, I feel, slow the game down and detract from immersion. So I'd be tempted to remove that. However, the way the game is designed, it is not too difficult to take stuff out and put stuff in. So I think that shouldn't be too much of a difficulty. So that's it for my review of Zweihander. If you enjoyed the review, please leave a like and subscribe if you'd like to see more old school role-playing game videos like this one. You can also join me on Patreon if you want to support me getting more books like this and making reviews of them. And leave any suggestions below in terms of what you like or dislike about Zweihander, and especially about old school games in the British mold from the Warhammer universe. Have you played those games in the past? What was your experience? Thanks for watching, everyone. I'll see you guys later.